Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Carles Boix. Carles, pronounce your last name again for the audience.
Oh, sure. My name is Carlos Boix.
All right then. So today we're going to be talking about your academic research and some of your papers. A few years ago, you published a paper titled Endogenous Parliaments, the Domestic and International Roots of Long-Term Economic Growth and Executive Constraints in Europe. And your co-author, Scott F. Abramson. I will have him on at some point. So, Carlos, why are we interested in studying parliaments? You and your co-author, Scott, have produced quite a bit of papers on parliaments. Why are they important?
Well, I think that they're important because, well, first of all, in a way, they are at the roots of democracy. So we want to know a bit more about the origins of parliament. But in the specific paper that you are mentioning, the objective or the goal of the paper was to look at growth in Europe and why is that some regions in Europe grew faster than others and industrialized earlier than other places, right? That's the main thrust of the paper. And here the question is to what extent, and it sort of engages a long literature, or what has become a big literature on the role of parliaments in fostering, promoting growth, or being a precondition to have development. That's basically the why we study parliaments in Europe.
Yes.
And so, yeah, go ahead.
You may go ahead.
Oh yeah, sure. So basically, to sort of give us some context to those that maybe or will watch us, is that in Europe, when you look at how it developed, Europe was extremely poor continent at around 1000 AD, so about 1000 years ago. If anyone had, looked at the Earth from the moon or whatever, or and would have put bets on which continent would have been, industrialized first and let the, modernization or modernized, I think it would not have been Europe. It was a very poor, sort of not very populated area. It had nothing to do with China or India or the Islamic world or many other places. But then in Europe, what you have when you see is that from that time on, there was a process of differentiation. So a core area grew. Basically, there was a process of growth of cities, the formation of a cluster of cities or urban agglomerations in a place that was basically agrarian and with very little trade and so on. We see this formation of cities in what is mostly the axis that goes from what is today London to northern Italy. So that's all around, Belgium, Netherlands, the Rhine, till the north of Italy. And that area that they started to urbanize first is still today a very, economically vibrant, the most vibrant region in Europe. It's what the European Union calls in fact, sometimes in some reports, the blue banana, because it has sort of a form of a banana, an inverted banana that goes from London to Germany and then down to Italy. And they call it blue because the flag of the European Union is blue. So it's even today, very vibrant. But the roots of that, you can trace them to the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. Whereas as you move away from that core, that blue banana, to the periphery, those areas are doing well, but they are not as rich, and they certainly they stayed poor till basically the 19th century, right? So we in the paper we take Europe as a place where we can see this process of change, of divergence, if you will, some places taking off, others not, and trying to understand why this happened. And I think that this is important to us because, of course, it's interesting in itself to understand how Europe developed, but also I think it's interesting because it may have lessons for us for growth in the whole world, right? So because at the time, as I said, like 1,000 years ago, Europe was very poor. By 1800, some places of Europe remain very poor. So in the Balkans, the per capita income levels, the income per person, as measured by economic historians like Angus Madison and others, basically were very similar to the poorest regions of the world. Is by right before the Industrial Revolution. But then there were areas in Europe, the blue banana, it was called the core of Europe, already by 1800 had a level of income per person, per capita income, that was about 4 to 5 times the level of 1200. So in a way, understanding, in our opinion, with this paper with Scott, understanding how Europe changed might give us some way of understanding processes of economic growth in the whole world. That's the purpose of the paper.
All
That
right.
caught your attention.
Yes.
And has brought me here.
Beautiful answer. So I follow your work closely, and you tend to hint at the topic, but you mentioned the Balkans. Places in Central and Eastern Europe are not as rich as places in Northwestern Europe. Why is this the case?
So can you repeat the last sentence?
Places in Central and Eastern Europe are not as rich as places in Northwestern Europe. So most of the research on the rise of the West, these studies have covered Northwestern Europe. But what about Eastern and Central Europe?
Yeah. So basically, that's where our paper comes in the sense that there is contention in the literature about the causes of development, or what led to this development in the Northwest, but not in other places. And so I would say that in the last decades, perhaps, or at least till since the publication of the work by Douglas North, mostly Nobel Prize winner in the 1980s, the sort of model that has had more, has a lot of people has persuaded or has led to a lot of research is what I would call institutional models. Basically posit that institutions are behind this divergence in development paths, so that depending on the kinds of institutions that you have in different regions or countries, they do differently, some better and some worse, right? And this literature, although it's kind of a bit unwieldy, there are many voices, let's say, in this literature. I think that the fundamental point is that institutions shape economic incentives in several senses. First, depending on there are institutions that protect property rights, and this allows for, this leads to investment. So if you have stable property rights and so on, then investors, companies are interested in investing in growing things, they innovate, and there is trade and so on. Also, they shape economic incentives, institutions, the literature claims, because they reduce transaction costs. So they reduce the cost of measuring transactions, they reduce the cost of monitoring the kinds of contracts that you make. So this leads to trade, allows people to specialize, kind of very Adam Smith story. And these can only happen with the right institutions, and then growth takes place. And these institutions, as I said, there is a debate about what they mean and which they are, but mostly people would talk about stable states and then constraints on the executive, having a system, an architecture within a state that makes sure that that there are no predators that in the state that laws are politicians and private actors abide by, and so on and so forth.
All
And
right.
so the point of this, sorry,
No, no, I thought that you were finished. That's why I said all right, but you may
oh, okay.
continue. You
No,
may
no,
continue.
almost, yeah, almost there. So, that they, just to recap what I was saying, right? The point of this literature is that if you get the institutional architecture right, then you will get growth. I think that's the sort of the main claim of this literature. And the paper for us is, although we teach, both Scott and I guess, at least I teach this literature and I enjoy it. To me, the problem fundamentally is, where do these institutions come from? So it's one thing to say, yeah, institutions matter, and I do not deny they matter, but the problem is, where do these institutions come from, right? And in the institutionalist literature, there are several answers. Some say, well, institutions basically respond to technological change. That if some changes happen, then actors sort of optimize and they choose the right institutions. Right? That's basically, if you think about it, this is how even Marx thought about in a way. But there are also modern institutionalists that would say that. But of course, the problem with this answer is that then you cannot explain why there are cases with countries where you have long instances of economic stagnation, right? So why is that? Even indeed, there are these good institutions and there are these technologies that you could attract and get people to invest. Why is that then these institutions are not introduced? So the second answer is, which I think is now more common, is to say, well, there are good institutions and bad institutions, and places that have bad institutions is basically because someone within the country blocks the introduction of good institutions, because the ones that are on top of the bad institutions, the rent seekers, the landlords, the whatever, the bandits that control the state, have no incentives to change things that may not be good for the whole country, but they are working for them, right? There is something to this, but then the problem is the following one: is that before 1800 or before 1500, or at some point in history, humankind live in a sort of what we would call now poverty. Growth is really something that has happened in the last 200 years. So if we believe this story, it means that everyone had bad institutions, and then good institutions come in some places like North and Western Europe or wherever, and then growth happens. So still, we do not have the answers to why, if indeed those that benefit from bad institutions are blocking change, why is that at some point there is this rupture and a good institution comes in place, right? And that's where we try to answer with a slightly, or I think, a different story in the paper.
Professor,
Yeah.
on a number of occasions, I have posed this question: social capital, how does it emerge? And years ago, over 20 years ago, you wrote a paper titled Social Capital, explaining its origins and effects on government performance. And I think that this old paper is crucial to this discussion, because we're talking about institutions and parliament, and social capital can lead to high quality institutions.
Well,
Yeah, I know it's an old paper, but social capital is an important topic. How do we get to
yeah,
Denmark?
it's an old paper that I wrote when I was young. So and yeah, so basically, it's nice that you bring up the social capital part, because when I was listing institutions, I was hesitating about making things more complicated by mentioning social capital. That paper, I wrote in a way out of frustration with a book that I'm in love with, which is Putnam's Making Democracy Work. where he pushes the origins of these different. So his claim is that performance across Italy in terms of regional governance differs depending on what he calls social capital, which is itself a very discussed concept. But I would say that, to me at least, is basically social capital is a set of expectations about the behavior of others that that they will cooperate with you, embedded in a set of institutions. And so my frustration with that book, that I still love, is that it doesn't really explain where it comes from. So in the paper, what we do with my co-author, with Dan Posner, is to kind of think about possible ways in which that thing called social capital was abundant in the North but not in the South happened. I think that it is, in a way, if you will, related to the paper that I have written with Abramson, that these norms of cooperation are part of this process that we call, self-sustaining or endogenous growth, that for some reason happened in some areas of Europe, but not in others. So, to answer the question of social capital, where it comes from, I'm not sure that I know the answer. In fact, I don't think I have the answer for anything set in stone. That's part of what we want to do, is to say, if we believe that institutions are important, we have to take very seriously institutions in the sense of parliaments and social capital and so on. We have to take very seriously the problem of where do they come from. And in the process of exploring that, what we find is that, to us at least, what we find is that institutions didn't precede the process of economic development, but were part of development itself, which I know it's, to some people, is very frustrating, because it's easier to go to the World Bank and say, if you want growth in Guatemala, or if you want growth wherever, then change the institutions. And we are more cautious given our results. I don't think you can say, oh, change the institutions, because institutions are part of a process that almost, if I may, is like organic, right? So it sort of develops over time and so on. I don't know if you want me to go into the theory a bit more.
You can, please do. I'm really interested in this topic, so please do.
Yeah, so basically our fundamental idea is, in a way, taken from what we call endogenous growth theory, which is a set of models developed by some economists. And we add things to that. So basically, our idea in the paper is that development is a function of the creation of the accumulation of knowledge. And this knowledge that allows for the efficient deployment of capital and labor, so that you become more efficient and you produce new things, and things you produce better and cheaper, and so on and so forth. That knowledge is a function of a population, a set of individuals, the innovators, producers, mostly problem-solving producers, that as they do things, they learn how to solve the problems they encounter. And in the process of, in the plant, in the factory, in the craft, whatever they are doing, very much like academics writing papers, that when you write, you learn how to do things, or not how to things, but to try to do things better. This population of innovators is fundamentally what leads to growth. So there's going to be more growth when the size of this class of innovators and problem solvers is bigger, right? So if you only have one inventor, someone that may have fantastic ideas but cannot speak to anyone, talk to anyone, discuss with anyone, then that's not going to lead him or her that far. But if you have a cluster of people, then they can exchange ideas, they can learn from each other, they can borrow from each other, and so on and so forth. And so the size is going to be important. And of course, the size is going to be a function of the population in general, right? So a place where you have a urban agglomeration to go, or a urban cluster or a city with more people than in a small village, you are going to have, in principle, on average, more of problem solvers and innovators. So this basically means that places where you have more population, especially more population that is not engaged in simply producing to survive, then you're going to have a class of people that are liberated from, say, agricultural tasks, and they can think and they can create new things, right? And so this population that is not, that is, is growing, but it's not completely tied to the land, that is not just producing to survive. This is going to happen in places where the characteristics of those places allow for population growth. So places that have, good soil, places where you can have transportation and so on and so forth that allow for some trade. Those places are going to have more population growth, and a population growth that of a certain kind, the kind that allows for some people to leave the countryside, knowing that they will trade things with others in the countryside, that they will cluster in cities, and there is artisanal, this class of innovators and problem solvers will emerge, will rise, will appear progressively, right? This doesn't go from one day to the other, but may take decades or centuries. So that's basically at the core of our theory. And to that, we add something else, and this is that in this process of the formation of this class of artisans and producers and so on and so forth, it's a precondition for growth, but also these artisans will develop institutions that will allow them to establish contracts among themselves, but also institutions that will, successful institutions in the sense that they will prevent predators from capturing that growth, right? Because I think that one of the fundamental things that sometimes we forget is that the emergence of growth leads to, the clustering of, in some places like in Europe, in the center of richer areas attracts a lot of, let's say, bandits or predators that would like to capture that growth, right? And if it's only when these artisans and these bourgeois create institutions that defend their wealth, but then growth can happen. And so if you don't mind, I don't want to tire you, but there is this beautiful story that Angus Deaton, who is a Nobel Prize winner, would explain me about development, and it has to do with India. So in India, there were these interventions in some places, in many places, to help women overcome poverty and create all these credit rotating associations, in a way creating social capital among women to make them freer and to empower them and so on and so forth. And they were successful, but in some places they were so successful that they would attract, they would lead to backlash from men that would try to capture and get all this new income from women that had been had benefited from these social capital institutions and so on. And so without protection for these, from predation, from abuse, from this income just would vanish. And so I think that the European story is one where you get the clustering of these populations in cities, a process of invention, but also these cities develop institutions that in a way protect them or establish guarantees among themselves, but also protect them from others, right? And that to us is at the core of what happened in Europe, right?
All right. Professor, you missed out an important element, urban agglomeration and how this process led to parliaments. This is a major part of your paper.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that this is a great way of moving from this very theoretical rendering of the story to a more more concrete explanation of what happened in Europe. So basically in Europe, urban agglomerations are very important in the following sense that about 1,000 years ago, after Europe stabilized. So as I think I told you at the beginning, it was a very poor continent that had been ravaged by invasions from barbarians, then Arabs, Vikings, whatever. The continent stabilizes by 1,000. There is then technological progress. We know that there are these inventions in agriculture like the heavy plow, the introduction of the three-field rotation, a set of things that increased the output, agricultural output, but especially in regions that had very rich soils. And this led to population growth. And this population growth led to a sort of population surplus that then clustered in cities that formed these what we call urban agglomerations. So towns, but not just towns, but also cluster agglomerations in the sense that there were regions of Europe where there are many towns very close to each other, right? I mean, when we talk about towns, we cannot think of towns in the modern sense, like, millions of people, but towns that had, 20, 40, 100,000 people, but there were many of them, right? So think about Italy. When we go to the north of Italy, there are so many cities with beautiful churches and palaces and everything. Or we go to Germany, or we go to the Netherlands. Well, these are, cities that are rooted in this process of agricultural growth, migration of some people to these cities, and there they start a process of the sort of industries, proto-industries, if you will, proto-manufacturers start to develop, right? Mostly textiles, iron forges. They also engage in trade with each other and also with other regions. And so this is a process that we can see happening in the 12th, 13th centuries. But what is very interesting is that those urban agglomerations, that area with stronger urban, like a urban belt, has enormous continuity over time, right? So those places that by 1200 had a lot of cities, those are the places that have today, even today, the most densely populated, more urbanized areas of Europe, right? So, and in those cities where there are all these economic changes, then there are also these institutional transformations. These cities are the places where there's demand for contract law, commercial law, to organize to make sure that the transactions among these new producers are well regulated. And there is also the institution of parliament, so that parliament in the broadest sense of the word, in mostly local councils. So think of a lot of cities in Europe were places where they were organized along guilds, right? So there were the Weavers Guild and the goldsmith and the shoemakers. And each guild had regulations about production, but also they contributed to the military forces of the city. So the way in which the city was organized was that the guilds themselves would provide for the defense of the city. And also, and they were then all together in a local council where there was representation of all these different arts and crafts, right? So that is a very peculiar structure. But the thing to us in the paper is that these institutions that for institutionalists, as I was telling at the beginning, seem to be the precondition for growth. What we find in our analysis is that they were not a precondition, they were part of the process. So so in our analysis, statistical analysis, which we do a very high level of disaggregation, so we look at very small units in Europe, it's not that institutions preceded growth, but they came along with growth. The two things took place, synchronically, in a way, right? So what we want is to, what we want in the paper is to say, look, institutions seem part of the modernization development process, but it is difficult to claim that they are, that if you introduce a parliament in a certain place, everything is going to there's going to be explosive growth, because these institutions are rooted in a very specific social context.
Yes. And so what you're basically saying is that economic growth led to demand for a certain type of institution. Is this the message of your piece, or one of the messages?
Yeah, I think that I wouldn't say that economic growth demanded institutions, but I would say that economic growth was of a certain type. It was embodied in a set of people that then organized themselves in ways that led to the formation of institutions that today we understand are related to good economic and also political performance.
All right.
And these institutions, to go back to your question about social capital, which I forgot to mention, in part are also about social capital. So there are these formal institutions we were talking about, like a state and parliament and law, but then there are these informal institutions, such as the fact that in these cities people know each other, they have ways in which they interact with each other, and this sustains a cooperation and a set of expectations about how others are going to behave that was conducive, or that's more than conducive, sustained growth and good performance.
All right. And this is the last question.
Yeah.
Constraints on the executive, do they always lead to growth?
Well, as I said, my answer is that they do not, they may be related to growth, but given what we find, they are part of the process of growth, right? Executive constraints exist because there is a class or a set of people that are organized in such a way that they establish institutions to constrain the executive. But those people, in a way, precede the formation of these institutions. So, yes, I mean, I always feel that my paper has this sort of sad side to it, because it would be easier for me to say, oh, institutions matter, let's invest a lot of money on creating institutions everywhere in the world, and then we are going to see growth. And I'm much more, I'm don't know if it's realistic or pessimistic, or at least prudent, and say, well, we have seen many places with institutions, but they just collapsed because there was nothing holding them, making them real, right? Giving them muscle and power to do things.
All right. So thanks for appearing on the show. I really enjoy our conversation. But in the future, Professor, if you want to do if you want to do another study on institutions, it would be good to look at some African case studies, because some African scholars are arguing that Africa had constitutional monarchies. So it would be good to test these data sets.
That would be great. Just to say that, besides the paper with Adamson, I published in 2015 a book called Political Order and Inequality, where I look at these questions beyond Europe. So there is much I have work that it goes beyond Europe, and that in that book I specifically look at Africa and Asia in the broader context of formation of states and so on. But yes, I think that looking at institutions beyond Europe is fundamental. The thing is that Europe has this interesting component, which is that the industrial revolution happened there, and that data-wise, there is a lot of data, so it makes a sense to study,
Yeah.
at least to me, to study. But I grant that one has to look at clearly beyond that.
All right. So I really, really enjoyed our conversation, but unfortunately I have to wrap up. So bye. All
Yeah,
right.
bye bye.
Thanks for coming.
Take care. Bye bye.